The first thing they stripped from her was her name. She stood on the block, barefoot, the sun-scorched dust of the square, a second, harsher skin upon her ankles. There was no bonnet to shield her face, no shawl to hide the rigid set of her shoulders, only a washed-out linen dress that had surrendered its form to years of labor and neglect. A profound stillness enveloped her, a silence so complete it could make a drunken brawler look away in shame. They bound her to the post with a length of rope that had seen better days, securing livestock. She offered no protest, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the jeering faces of the crowd. The auctioneer, a man whose theatrics were as worn as his boots, cleared his throat and made a show of consulting a ledger that was entirely for effect. His voice sliced through the oppressive afternoon heat. 17 years of age, hardy, with no recorded afflictions, versed in both field and domestic duties, and quiet. A snicker rippled through the onlookers. A woman fanned her flushed face with a painted fan, creating a stir in the stagnant air. From the edge of the crowd, leaning against the saloon's warped railing, her mother watched. Arms crossed, a sneer etched onto her lips, she stared at her daughter as if she were a failed crop. Her eyes, clouded with cheap whiskey and a lifetime of disappointments, were harder than stone. "She's not much to look at," the mother slurred, her voice a ragged tear and fabric of the afternoon. "But I'm done putting food in her mouth. She belongs to whoever will drag her off today." A fresh wave of whispers erupted. "That's the girl from out past Stone Creek, the one with no kin but the drunkard selling her like a sack of meal. Heard she tried to run off with a peddler once. Never seen her crack a smile." The auctioneer ignored the commentary, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "Who will offer for the girl? She's a quiet worker, asks for little." No one moved. Men sized her up and then turned away, their interest fleeting. A merchant near the front chuckled and shook his head. A boy muttered a crude joke and was silenced by a sharp jab from his mother's elbow. The girl's eyes remained downcast, fixed on the dirt, her expression one of grim acceptance. Then, a figure detached itself from the shadows near the blacksmith's forge. He was a tall man, clad in a long, travel-stained duster, his hat pulled low, casting his face in shadow. The dust on his boots was old, from a road far from this town. "Isn't that the widower from Gallows Ridge?" a woman whispered. "Heard he lost his wife to the fever. Hasn't hired help since." The man didn't seem to be watching the spectacle. He was observing it. He took a step forward, his movement deliberate. He raised a single hand, a gesture so slight it was almost missed, yet it shattered the heavy silence like a stone through glass. "I'll take her," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried, steady and clear. The auctioneer squinted. "You'll take her?" He gave a single decisive nod. "Is she yours to sell?" The mother spat a contemptuous laugh. "She's mine to be rid of." The man moved closer, placing a few coins into the auctioneer's waiting palm. It wasn't a grand sum, nor was it a pittance. It was simply enough. He didn't approach her immediately. He just stood there, his gaze resting on her. She refused to meet his eyes, her focus locked on the rough rope chafing her wrists. With unhurried movements, he withdrew a small pocket knife and sliced through the cord. She didn't even flinch. "Are you harmed?" His voice was low, devoid of pity. A simple shake of her head. "What do they call you?" The silence that answered was her only name. He stepped back, giving her space. "My wagon is over there. You can come or you can stay. The choice is yours." For a moment that stretched into an eternity, she remained frozen. The crowd held its collective breath. Then, slowly, she stepped down from the crate. Her legs trembled, nearly buckling beneath her, but she caught herself. He didn't offer a hand, but he fell into step beside her. his pace measured to match her weary gait. Together they walked away from the square, the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on their backs. They reached a plain wooden wagon hitched to a stoic-looking mule. He helped her into the back and passed her a canteen without another word. As the wagon creaked into motion, the town dissolved behind them into a haze of dust and judgment. She didn't ask their destination. She didn't speak at all. But she drank the water as if it were a sacrament, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she allowed herself to draw a full, deep breath. The path away from that town unspooled before them, a long, quiet thread of dirt and silence. The afternoon sun bled from amber to gold, finally bruising into dusk. Shadows stretched from the tall grasses, clinging to the wagon wheels like weary travelers. He drove with a calm, unhurried rhythm. She sat in the back, watching the road they had traveled disappear behind them, her face a mask of weary composure. When the mule finally halted, the sky was a deep, velvet lavender. In the dim light, the silhouette of a house appeared, hunched against the horizon like an old man bracing against the wind, flanked by a gnarled, leafless oak and a barn that seemed to sag with the weight of its own history. "This is the place," he stated simply. A lit lantern was waiting on a post. He helped her down. "The kitchen is through that door. There's a room for you upstairs. Are you hungry?" She shook her head. He held the door for her. The inside smelled of cedar smoke and old wood, a clean, spiritual scent. There were no frills, no lace curtains, just sturdy, worn furniture, and a single, faded photograph hanging above the cold hearth. "You don't know who I am," he said, breaking the silence. "I know," she replied, her voice a dry whisper. He gestured towards the staircase. "Top of the stairs, room on the left." She ascended without a word, leaving the door to her room ajar. He didn't follow. The next morning he found her at the sink, washing the mugs from the night before. "You don't need to do that," he said. "I don't mind," she answered, not turning around. They ate their breakfast in a silence that was not awkward, but rather spacious. There were no prying questions, no forced pleasantries. He noticed the way she flinched when a gust of wind rattled the window pane. She noticed the slight limp in his left leg. Later, she swept the porch. He mended a broken fence post. She folded the laundry into precise, neat squares. He left a heavy woolen shawl draped over the banister one cool evening, never mentioning it, never insisting she wear it. The days began to weave themselves together, not with grand events, but with these quiet, unspoken gestures. A silence that was not empty, but expectant. She observed the small rituals of his life, how he always fed the mule before himself, how he would rest a hand on the weathered gate-post as if greeting an old friend. He in turn noticed the patterns of her trauma, how a clap of thunder made her shoulders hunch, how she meticulously peeled the crusts from her bread before eating, how she would stand outside long after the sun had set, staring at the horizon as if waiting for a sign. One evening, she finally asked the question that had been hovering between them. "Why did you take me?" He took his time answering, pouring coffee into 2 tin mugs and handing one to her. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and gravelly, "Because no one else was going to." She stared into the rising steam. "You could have chosen someone prettier," she whispered. He met her gaze without wavering. "I didn't need pretty." "What did you need?" His eyes drifted towards the dark outline of the barn. "Someone who wouldn't leave." She said nothing more that night, but the following evening she took the chair a little closer to his. The girl whose ankles were caked in dust had found herself in a house that asked for nothing, and the man who had emptied his life of everything had made room for something he never intended to find. Neither of them would have called it hope, but on that quiet porch, beneath a bruised and star-dusted sky, 2 chairs were set, and for the very first time, both were occupied. She awoke to a light that felt unfamiliar. It filtered through the thin muslin curtains, soft and tentative, as if it were afraid to startle her. The old bed frame groaned as she sat up, and she instinctively tensed, waiting for a sharp command that never came. The only sounds were the slow, rhythmic creaks of the old house and the faint whistle of a kettle from downstairs. The rancher was already outside, his heavy boots imprinting a familiar path in the morning dew. She made the bed with the same meticulous precision she did everything, pulling the quilt taut, squaring the corners with a practiced efficiency born from a life where order was a form of armor. In the kitchen, a piece of folded paper sat on the table. In a strong, masculine hand, it read, "Coffee's hot, in the barn, feeds in the trough if you feel up to it." There was no command, just an offering. She read it twice before tucking it into the pocket of her apron. And in that small moment, a knot of tension she hadn't even realized she carried in her shoulders began to loosen. She followed his footprints to the barn. The morning air was clean and crisp, a welcome contrast to the oppressive stillness of the town. He was inside, hammering a bent hinge back into shape, and didn't look up as she entered. Golden shafts of sunlight pierced the gaps in the wooden slats, illuminating swirling motes of dust like tiny, silent ghosts. "I can help," she offered, her voice quiet but clear. He didn't pause his work. "You certain?" She nodded. "I know how to work." He gestured with his hammer towards a pile of hay. "You can pitch it out. Fresh bedding is stacked by the far wall." He asked nothing about how she had slept, nothing about the life she had left behind. He simply gave her space. That was his way. They fell into a natural rhythm, working in a shared silence that was more companionable than any conversation. He repaired a broken stall door, she shoveled and swept. The air between them was filled not with words, but with the steady cadence of labor. It was not quite harmony, but it was no longer dissonance. By noon, her hair was damp with sweat. He handed her a tin cup of water without a word. She drank, and as she passed it back, their fingers brushed. It was a fleeting, insignificant touch, yet it felt like a current passing between them. Later, she stood by the fence, watching the wind move through the tall grass in gentle, undulating waves. He came and stood beside her, a silent presence. "Did you build this place?" she asked. He nodded once. "Most of it." "Why?" He stared out at the sprawling land. "Because someone had to, and I was the one still here." She understood, without needing him to explain, the weight of loss held within that simple statement. That evening, the kitchen was filled with the comforting aroma of simmering stew and the crackle of a fire in the hearth. The house felt less like an empty vessel and more like a place that was simply holding its breath. She began to notice the small details of his existence, the way he always placed his boots side by side near the door, the gentleness with which his large, calloused hands handled a fragile plate. He noticed things too, how she always turned her face toward the fire, as if she had been cold her entire life, how she invariably chose the chipped bowl for herself, and how she listened with an intensity that suggested words had once been used against her like weapons. The next morning, she found a neatly folded piece of cloth on the kitchen table. It was a new apron, stitched by a rough but careful hand. She traced the seams with her fingertips as if it were the finest silk. By the third day, she could recognize the pattern of his limp in the sound of his footsteps on the porch. He knew the soft, toneless hum she made when she was peeling apples. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a growing understanding. But the ghosts of the past still lingered. Each night he would pass a closed door at the end of the hall, and she would see a shadow cross his face, his jaw clenching for a fraction of a second. One day she tried the knob. It was locked. When she asked him about it later, his answer was clipped. That was her room. No name, no story. She didn't push. That night, lying in her own bed, she thought of all the rooms that had been locked to her, rooms of punishment and shame. And here she was in a house where she was free to leave, yet felt a strange reluctance to move. A week later, the sky broke open. The rain came suddenly, a torrential downpour as if the heavens could no longer contain their grief. She stepped out onto the porch and lifted her face to the deluge, letting it wash over her, a baptism for a soul that had forgotten what it felt like to be clean. He watched her from the doorway for a long moment, then he removed his coat, walked out into the storm, and draped it over her trembling shoulders. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. That night, for the first time, the silence at the dinner table was broken by stories. She told him about the first time she was sent to work in the fields, how her hands had bled and no one had so much as offered her a bandage. He told her about a foal born too soon, how he had sat with it for 3 nights straight, only to lose it in the end. There were no tears, but something between them softened, like the first thaw of a long winter. The town, however, had not forgotten. A neighbor brought word that people were whispering, "The auction girl." A man rode out to the ranch, offering the rancher a handful of coins to take her off his hands, assuming she was nothing more than temporary labor. The rancher didn't raise his voice, didn't raise a hand. He simply stood on his porch and said, "She is under my roof. You will leave. Now." That night she asked him, "Why do they despise me so much?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Because you remind them of every decent thing they were too cowardly to do. You remind them that they stood by and watched a mother trade her daughter for coin, and they did nothing." She looked into his eyes and saw not pity, but a shared weariness. "I'm not broken," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm just tired." "I know that too." They sat on the porch again, the space between their chairs a little smaller than before, and the old house seemed to breathe with them, a long, slow exhale. That night she left the door to her room cracked open, not as an invitation, but as a sign of trust. He noticed, but he did not cross the threshold. The floorboards between them no longer felt like an ocean, and for now, that was enough. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise when they hitched the wagon. The girl stood on the porch, her fingers twisting the fabric of the shawl he'd given her. She watched the distant smudge of the town, her expression a mixture of apprehension and resolve. He came to stand beside her, pulling on his coat against the rising wind. "Are you sure you want to go?" he asked. She nodded. "We need flour and salt, and I need some thread." He didn't argue. They rode in a comfortable silence, the familiar jolts of the wagon a rhythmic counterpoint to the quiet beat of their own hearts. She sat a little straighter now, he noticed, and she noticed the way he would glance at her hands when he passed her the reins, as if checking to see that the calluses were healing. When they arrived in town, the atmosphere had soured. The stares were longer this time, more openly hostile. "There she is," a woman muttered from behind her hand, "the auction girl." They walked into the general store, the bell above the door jangling discordantly. The shopkeeper's smile was thin and brittle. "Back for more seed, are you?" "Just supplies," the rancher said, his voice even. The girl moved through the aisles with a quiet purpose, gathering what they needed. But as she reached for a spool of cotton thread, another woman's hand shot out and slapped hers away. "You don't put your hands on the good things," the woman sneered, her face a mask of petty cruelty. "This isn't some whore's pantry." The girl froze, the breath catching in her throat. The shopkeeper watched, unmoving. The rancher took a slow, deliberate step forward. "That's enough," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "You're the one who bought her. What does it matter what she touches?" He looked first at the red mark blooming on the back of the girl's hand, then met the woman's gaze. "You speak to her that way again, and you will wish I had raised my voice." They left without the thread. The ride back was heavy with an unspoken tension. She kept her face turned away, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "I'm sorry," he said finally. She shook her head, not looking at him. "You didn't do it." Her voice was tight. "But you couldn't stop it either. I'm so tired of being looked at like I'm something to be scraped off the bottom of a boot." "You're not." She finally turned to him, her eyes blazing. "Then what am I?" He didn't answer right away. "You're the truth they're all too afraid to face." The rain began then, a soft drizzle that quickly escalated into a torrential downpour. Thunder cracked overhead, and the mule shied, sending the wagon skidding in the mud. "We'll have to take shelter in the barn," he shouted over the storm. They ran for it, the rain soaking them to the bone. Inside, the wind howled through the rafters, and the old roof groaned under the assault. They stood there, dripping and panting, the storm raging around them. "Why did you say that to her?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because it was the truth. But you don't know me. You don't know the things I've done. I know enough. No, you don't, she insisted, stepping closer. You don't know what I let happen to me. He stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. Then tell me. She looked away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I was 15 the first time my mother offered me to a man for a bottle of whiskey. She said a girl has to learn to be practical in this world. He didn't flinch, didn't turn away. I tried to run once. They caught me and locked me in the root cellar for 3 days. After that, I stopped fighting. Her voice broke. You bought me, just like they did. No, he said, his voice firm. I didn't buy you. I paid to end the auction. He looked at her then, truly looked at her with an expression of fierce, protective sorrow. I didn't know your story, but I could see the ending they were writing for you. And you think you can just change it? No, he said softly. I think you can. A tremendous groan echoed through the barn and a section of the roof buckled. He looked up just in time to see a heavy beam splintering. He shoved her out of the way, and the beam crashed down, striking his shoulder and sending him sprawling into the mud. She scrambled to his side, her heart pounding in her chest. Don't move. I'm fine, he gritted out, but a dark stain was already spreading across his sleeve. You're not, she sobbed, cradling his head in her lap. You're bleeding. It's not so bad. You're crying, he rasped. She hadn't even realized it. I didn't want you to get hurt. I would rather be hurt than watch them drag you back to that hell. She pressed her forehead to his, her tears mingling with the rain on his face. You said I could change the ending. I believe you can. Then stay alive to see it. A faint, pained smile touched his lips. That's a fine order. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. The rancher sat propped against a barrel in the damaged barn, his shoulder bandaged. She brought him a mug of hot coffee, and their fingers brushed as he took it. This time, neither of them pulled away. The barn was broken, but the house was still standing. And so were they. The morning arrived as if on tiptoe, the land holding its breath in the aftermath of the storm. Mist draped itself across the fields, a soft, gray blanket. Inside the barn, the girl sat beside the rancher, a shared silence of survival wrapping around them. His bandage was stained with blood, but he made no complaint. She cleaned and readdressed the wound with a practiced touch, a skill learned from a lifetime of tending to the hurts of those who never offered thanks. You should be in the house, she said softly. He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the pale morning light. The roof needs seeing to. You almost died. Almost isn't the same as did, he countered, his voice calm. She looked up and Hebes stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked at him with an unnerving clarity. I have to leave. He didn't argue or protest. You can. I'm not saying I want to. I'm saying I have to. I know. Why aren't you trying to stop me? Because needing to go isn't the same as choosing to stay. His words struck her with an unexpected force. He rose slowly, a wince of pain crossing his face before he masked it. I'll hitch the wagon. I wasn't asking you to. I'm not asking for permission. By noon, her small satchel was packed. It contained little more than a change of clothes, the spool of thread he had gone back into town to buy for her, leaving it on her pillow without a word, and the mended apron. He stood by the mule, the reins in his hand, his expression unreadable. She walked down the porch steps and paused, the house looming behind her, no longer just a structure of wood and nails, but a place of quiet refuge. You should be able to leave however you need to, he said, as if reading her thoughts. She climbed into the wagon, but the mule refused to budge. She tugged on the reins, but the animal stood firm. The rancher looked back, a faint, knowing smile on his lips. He won't go. Why not? Because he was born on this land. Animals know when they're carrying someone who doesn't truly want to leave. She stared at the stubborn mule, then up at the vast, empty sky, and finally down at her own trembling hands. I'm scared, she whispered. I thought leaving would make me free, but I just feel empty. That's because freedom isn't about where you go, he said, walking towards her. It's about what you choose. She climbed down from the wagon and faced him. What if I chose to stay? Then I'd have to build a new fence line, he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Why? Because it wouldn't just be my land anymore. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Would I be your wife? He looked at her with the same steady gaze he'd had at the auction, in every quiet moment they had shared. Only if you wanted to be. What if I don't know how? Then we'll learn together. He extended his hand, not as a command or a claim, but as a question, and for the first time in her life, she chose her answer. She placed her hand in his. Their wedding was a simple affair, conducted not by a preacher, but by the quiet vows of two souls who had found each other in the wreckage. They stood by the creek as the sun dipped low, the water flowing slow and golden. I'm not clean, she said, her voice trembling. I'm not new. I'm not asking for either. I'd be wary of anyone who claimed to be. Later, they sat by a fire, and she took out the old, tattered scarf she had kept hidden, a relic of a life she was ready to release. She threw it into the flames and watched it burn. It was my mother's, she whispered. He handed her a chair he'd sanded smooth that morning, and they sat together on the porch as the sky turned from amber to a deep, bruised purple. I think I want to belong here. Then you already do. She reached out and laid her hand on the back of his. It was a simple, deliberate gesture of claiming and of being claimed. The wind carried the scent of pine and earth, and the porch, once a place of silent vigil, now held the promise of a shared future. She had not just stayed, she had chosen. The mornings were different after that. She moved through the house with a newfound sense of ownership, her hands bringing a quiet warmth to the once dusty corners. She stitched new curtains, humming tuneless melodies as she worked. The house no longer felt empty. It felt inhabited. He repaired the barn, his movements slow but sure. They worked side by side, a comfortable rhythm established between them. One morning she found a small wooden box on her windowsill. Inside was a dried wildflower, a blue ribbon, and a folded piece of paper. In his rough handwriting it said, "You are not what they named you. You are what you survived and what you chose." The town began to see her differently, too. A neighbor brought over a jar of preserves and asked for her help sewing a christening gown. I'd be honored. And in that moment, the world shifted. One evening, as the air grew colder, she sat on the porch, her bare feet propped up on the rail. I don't think I could ever go back. Not just to that town, but to who I was. You don't have to, he said. Some goodbyes don't need to be spoken. That night, lying beside him in the dark, she whispered, I've never felt safe before. That's what a home is for, he answered. A week later, they rode into town and signed the marriage papers, witnessed by no one but the wind and the dust. Back at the house, she took off her boots and walked barefoot across the threshold. She turned to him, a slow smile spreading across her face. Welcome home, she said. He took down the faded photograph from above the fireplace and placed it gently in a drawer. In its place, she hung a simple piece of embroidered cloth with two names stitched side by side, and beneath them the single word, enough. They were not saved or healed in any miraculous way. They were simply two broken people who had chosen to build something new from the pieces. In a world that had once auctioned her worth, she had claimed her own. In a house that had been hollowed by loss, he had learned to make room for love. And the house, like them, finally learned to breathe again. It breathed with the rhythm of shared chores, with the sound of quiet laughter, with the warmth of two chairs, always filled on the old wooden porch. For some broken things do not need to be fixed. They simply need a place to belong.